I am a social worker in Warrington, so I'm just an ASYE plus a few months. So I finished my ASYE a few months ago, and I have been involved in the Each One Teach One programme for just over, I think, since last year. In Warrington, just to give you a bit of context, following the murder of George Floyd, we had a principal social worker decided to introduce an anti-racism practice group. Part of that was just to explore our response to the Black Lives Matters movement. So I've been involved in that since around October 2020, and the Each One Teach One, which we're involved in today, for us was a natural progression from that. So there's myself and another colleague, Sadia, who've been working together to pull together this conversation piece in Warrington, and we've delivered it to some of our trainee student social workers and to some other groups within the organisation. So we just welcome any feedback. If you want to give any feedback on my presentation to Nicola, we'd welcome that. And obviously the purpose of this is to start conversations and to help facilitate some of the difficult conversations that we feel we need to have. So apologies, but I will be asking Nicola to change the slide at different points because she's sharing my presentation for me. So our conversation piece is on getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the reason we chose that was because we felt that it was important when we're talking about anti-racism to be able to go to places where we might not have gone before. We've had lots of conversations and lots of opportunities to talk about racism and anti-racism over the past decade, certainly throughout my lifetime. There's, you know, the murder of George Floyd wasn't the first time we were prompted to have those conversations. You know, we've been around during the murder of Anthony Walker and Stephen Lawrence, and they have also prompted similar conversations. But I think what we wanted to focus on is how do we take those conversations to a deeper level? How do we make sure that those conversations have an impact? It's not just something that we do today and then we move on from until the sort of next time, but actually they have a lasting impact on our actions and our behaviours. So this first image is something that I would want you to maybe consider. What do you feel like this image is showing? What do you feel we're trying to represent here in terms of the focus on anti-racism? So what I would like you to do is at this stage, if you just want to put your hand up, if you'd like to share your reflections on the image that's on the screen. And then we'll take your, if you just want to unmute yourself while you're speaking, and then don't forget to mute yourself afterwards so that we don't have any interference. I can see one hand up, but I think that hand has been up since before I started speaking. So it's Craig Rawlinson. Thank you, Craig. You've taken it down now. Thank you. So it's a legacy hand. But just if anyone's got any initial responses, what is happening in the image that I'm showing on the screen? What is it that you feel this image is representing? You've got two images of people and some chains. I hope everyone can see the screen. I don't know if some of you are joining via mobiles or whatever, but if you can see the screen, which Nicola is sharing, can you just put your hand up if you'd like to share your initial response? We've got over 80 people in the session, so if we can manage it with hands up in this way, then we'll take hands up. But if there's if we've got more people and there's more opportunity to have a discussion, we'll break out into breakout rooms and discuss it there. Okay, so at this stage I'm just asking for hands up if you know how to put your hands up. If you don't, then just shout out if you want to say something and you can't see how to put your hands up, and we'll try and manage that. Okay, so first question is, what's happening in the image there? So because this is a conversation piece, I'm trying not to make it just a presentation and want to promote some dialogue and involvement of the audience. So if you want to put your hands up, put your hands up. If not, I'll carry on. So I've got Craig, your hand's gone up again. Thank you very much. So Craig, would you like to share? Thank you very much for responding.
both of them in chains for a start. So.
Yeah, thank you. And what do you think the difference is between the chains for the person at the top and the bottom of the seesaw?
Unmute yourself. Well, the person of colour's lower down the scale, and the white person's in chains, but for, more successful in chains. I don't know. That makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you. We've got a few now, so great for kicking us off. You want to tell us what your view is, please? I think you're still muted.
Did you want me to? It's Christy. On number 2, I think. Did you want me to say? I just thought the chains would look like holding up in place and then holding down in place. So it was kind of keeping people in that status quo, and the pivot is about redressing the balance in some of these uncomfortable conversations about how you feel uncomfortable in that space, but that doesn't mean to avoid it. So I think the arms and the chains were about holding in one place and being kept in another.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christy. I'm sorry to the person before, but I didn't think you could unmute yourself, so apologies that we couldn't hear you. So this conversation that we're having today is about evening out that seesaw. How do we rebalance? And if we're really committed to anti-racism, there's 2 things that need to happen. For that person who stood on the ground, who's being chained down and maybe held back by disadvantage, oppression, racism, microaggressions, all the things that you'll be exploring today and will have had in your anti-racism conversations, for that person to be pulled up and to be able to get to that place of equality, the person at the top who is in a position of advantage or privilege also has to be able to level down. And that's the challenge. That's why this is an uncomfortable conversation, because if we've got people who are privileged and underprivileged, or advantaged and disadvantaged, to be able to level the playing field, it's about the person who's at the top being willing to concede some of their advantage or power. That's not about that person giving somebody else some money or some of their belongings, but for people to catch up, for things to be leveled out. We've got to be prepared that actually, if you are in front, if you are somebody with a huge amount of privilege, are you ready to let other people catch up with you, or are you trying to maintain that privilege? And so how I perceive this image is that the person on the ground is being held down, but the person at the top is actually holding on to those chains and is wanting to stay in that position potentially, because we are much more afraid psychologically of things that we might lose than we are of things that we might gain. That's a much bigger, powerful motivator for some of us if we're worried about what we might lose. And that's the reality of trying to even things out from an anti-racism point of view. If we want to genuinely have equality, then we've got to be prepared to give up some of the advantage that we have. And that's why this is a difficult conversation for people to be able to have. So one of the things I wanted to say as well at the start is language is really important when we're talking about anti-racism. You know, the language I use in this presentation, if I refer to the term black, I just want to say I'm referring to that politically, and it's all encompassing for marginalised groups and communities, not just people from the African diaspora or of African Caribbean heritage. So just so people are aware. So for this levelling up to take place, we've got to be able to have some dialogue and promote dialogue, and we've got to be honest and prepared to have very, very upfront conversations about our power position and what that does and how we need to shift in our power and our own position in order to help people catch up or move forward. There are certain types of emotions around anti-racism that can distort those conversations. many of you, and myself included, would have responded to the George Floyd murder with feelings of shame. Some people might have felt guilt. There was a lot of people that were very overwhelmed with a sense of fear and powerlessness. Those kinds of emotions, some of them we have to question whether they are helpful in us moving forward. We have to acknowledge the feelings that we have as social workers. Nobody's proposing that you try to push those or suppress those emotions, but certainly what's important is that we try to acknowledge them and be prepared to move on from them. So acknowledge the shame, the guilt, all of those things, but we have to park that. And as social work practitioners, we have to consider, if you were going into work with a family and that family had, there'd been a particular type of abuse within that family, if you are trying to affect change within that family, conversations about guilt and shame, yes, you might need to have them initially, but that can't be the driving force for change, because it's unlikely to be a sustainable, deep second order change that you put in place. It's more likely to be something that's much more fragile and therefore likely to fall apart. So I think we've got to try and acknowledge those feelings and put them somewhere and then move on from those feelings if we genuinely want to change the inequalities that we have in our society. So the next thing I'm going to show you, Nicola, if you'd like to put the next slide on. This is an image from an anthropologist who, try not to read the small text, just look at the picture. So it's an anthropologist, and he had a group of children, and this is where the concept of Ubuntu came from. What he said was to the children, there's a basket of fruit over there under the tree. I'm going to give you a chance to have a race, and you can go over to the tree and you can try to win the basket of fruit by running to the tree as fast as you can. And what he expected was the children to scramble to the tree and try and compete against each other to find this basket of fruit so they could keep it. But what in reality happened, and if we were doing this face to face, I'd pause there and let you have a discussion about it and ask you what you think might have happened. But what actually happened is the young children held hands and went towards the basket of fruit together. And when the anthropologist asked them to explain their behaviour and why they hadn't competed for the basket of fruit, what they talked about was something called the concept of Ubuntu, which is about how can one of us be happy when the rest of them are sad. It's about the fact that we are all interconnected. Our happiness is all interlinked with each other's happiness. And so the reason I'm sharing that concept with you is because there will be people that you try to have conversations with about anti-racism, and their response might well be, why should I be interested? What has this got to do with me? Isn't that so 2020? We've moved on from Black Lives Matters and all sorts of other things. And I think it's really important that we teach people that actually racism affects all of us. The things that are felt and experienced have an impact on the whole community and societies. We can't separate ourselves off. If you think that there's people over there, not people like, who do you expect to stand up for you if that does end up being you in the future? So there's lots of different arguments we can give for why we expect people to buy into a commitment to anti-racism. I hope you don't have to have that argument with people within your organisations, but if you do, that's why I was sharing the concept of Ubuntu. It's about our interconnectedness. It's a bit of a contradiction, because over the last few decades, we've shifted as a society so much more close to our individualism, to saying to people, you can be who you are, be an individual, do these things and don't worry about community and society to a certain extent. And it almost feels like looking at our interconnectedness is a contradiction to that. But I think those things can sit alongside each other. We can be individual, but we can't escape the fact that what happens to some people in our society is going to affect other people in our society, and eventually it's going to affect us. When we're talking about what we need to remember is that racism is, and what we talk about, is just the visible, tangible manifestation of a much deeper issue. I grew up in the Northwest. I actually grew up in Liverpool, and when I was a child, I was one of the only non-white faces in my primary school. I was one of the only non-white faces in the area where I lived. And at that time, racism was much more overt. This is at the time when we had the initial Race Relations Act. Before we had the Toxteth riots and Brixton riots, etc. People would wind their window down on my way to school or while I was playing out and shout the N-word out of the window just because they wanted to. Where I lived, people would quite willingly put National Front stickers on our front door, and you know, all sorts of other things, comments about monkeys and all sorts of things that are overtly racist. Now, many people, when you try and have a conversation about anti-racism, may well say, well, we don't really have racism here. It's not as bad as it used to be, or we've come a long way. And I think what you'll hear from a lot of people from minority or ethnic groups, or you know, Black, as I said at the start, politically, is that racism has just shifted to become much more sort of nuanced. So instead of someone shouting the N-word, what we have to deal with these days is lots of microaggressions or exclusion from opportunities. So it's not that racism isn't there. It's definitely very much so. It exists in our lives and our experiences on a day-to-day basis. It is something that is felt and is very real for the people who experience it. The fact that it's become more subtle doesn't mean it's any less painful or any less damaging to our societies and to the people who experience it. So that's just something that I think I would want you to consider. So if I can ask, just go back a second, Nicola, sorry. Can I ask if we could have breakout rooms for a couple of minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so what I would like you to discuss in your breakout room, given what I've said so far, we'll give you just a couple of minutes for a very brief discussion, is why do you feel there has been, and this is something I'm arguing, that there has been a lack of progress on equality for racial equality? So I would argue that over the last 2 or 3 decades, we have made some progress on generally on equalities issues, so to do with gender equality, disability equality, sexual orientation. And I argue that the progress made in those equalities issues has been significant, and yet there has been very little progress on racial equalities issues. So I'm asking you to discuss in your groups, one, do you agree with me? Because you can, that is the case, you feel we have not made enough progress.
Lucretia, you broke up a little bit there. So I'll put the question in the chat for people to have a little look. So it's whether they agree with the question, whether they disagree.
For that discussion in your groups. So some of the points I'll just touch on very quickly because we need to move a bit faster through this. So in the discussion I was in, Siobhan raised the point that we have a narrative as a culture, and for example, the women's movement, we talk about women having the right to vote, but it doesn't really tell us everything about that story. And so we need to be mindful that sometimes there's bits of the story or the conversation that have been missed and we're not aware of. So that might be one of the reasons. Socialization. So there is a massive focus at the moment, especially since George Floyd's death, on decolonizing the curriculum and trying to address those issues in the education. And I think Angela talked about the fact that maybe some of this is through ignorance. Some people think because we've got the Equalities Act, that's enough, but the facts and statistics don't match up to that. And then we had Abby just talking about an example that we have to be prepared to stand up and challenge some of these racisms that we deal with and we face, even if it's not directly affecting us. So those are some of the points that were raised in my group. If you were delivering this conversation piece in your organisation, you'd want to obviously gather feedback from different groups, but because we're pressed for time, I'm going to move on, if that's okay. So the next slide, please. This is one of the reasons why I feel we haven't really made progress. So this is a quote from a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And I won't read it out for you. I think you probably can see it, but it talks about the psychology of racism. And one of the things that I think is critical is that we don't just look at racism as a sociological issue. We need to look at it from an economic point of view, a psychological point of view, and a sociological point of view. If we really truly want to tackle it, we need to try and understand why it's so pervasive. Why has it been so difficult to move on with this one equalities issue when we've made massive strides forward in other equalities issues? And one of the reasons I think, and this is just me reflecting on the issue, is because of this psychology. Racism is very pervasive. It's not something that has only been around in the last 100 years. If you think about colorism particularly, and this concept of black being lesser than white, that concept is rooted back in many, many different ideals and structures in different parts of the world. So if you just move forward, please, Nicola. So what I want to get across is the point that there's also been some conditioning of people and of society to entrench that view of this inequality between black and white. So, for example, out of, Hinduism is a very ancient set of religious traditions, and within that tradition, which predates all of the bits of modern sort of policy and everything else that we have, in that structure we have something called a caste system, or that's summed up as a caste system. And people believe that you are born into a certain caste, and that caste that you're born into, it bestows upon you certain rights and privileges, but also spiritual status. And it's correlated with skin tone in some places, where the people at the top of that system, of the hierarchical system, with lighter skins would tend to be from the Brahmin caste, which is the priest caste, and at the very bottom, you would tend to have the sort of menial sort of worker castes or classes, and those people would tend to have darker skins. But there was a spiritual aspect to this as well, which was that the lower down this system, you were considered to be more polluting spiritually and less pure spiritually. So that's just to give you an example of something that is thousands of years old, where we've got this colorism embedded into a system. We then move on and look at the scramble for Africa and the economic incentives that were there for colonization and the enslavement of millions of Africans. Again, some of that was justified through scripture because they were not perceived as being as human or as equal or as deserving of human rights as anybody else. Even after the end of slavery, where if there's a documentary on Netflix called Amend, and if you look at that, it's really fascinating. And it talks about how after the abolition of slavery in America, it kept being overturned, and there was so much campaigning to revert back to the way it was, and all sorts of loopholes were being explored. Maybe they're not human, maybe they don't have the same rights. When it says all men, does it mean all men, or does it just mean all white men? There was all sorts of attempts there to try and revert back to suppressing the Africans in America for economic benefit and incentives. Then you've got the apartheid system in South Africa, which has only been overturned in my lifetime. When I was coming to the end of my GCSE education, the apartheid regime was just coming to an end. Nelson Mandela was about to be released from prison, and apartheid was a system introduced by the white British and Afrikaner, who were former Dutch settlers in South Africa, to create a system, a hierarchical system within society, which is as it shows on that pyramid there. So you've got different statuses within society depending on your skin tone, and they had things like a pencil test, where you put a pencil in someone's hair to see if it falls out. That would determine whether you are coloured or not, and which class you go into or which group you go into. So at the top of this hierarchy, you had white. At the very bottom, we had black. And if you were black in South Africa, although you might be native to that country, when it was apartheid, you had pass laws. If you wanted to travel the equivalent of Warrington to London, you would need to have a pass, like a passport, to say to the police that you had the right to be able to do that. They had white-only beaches, black-only beaches, white-only schools, black-only schools. And I was fortunate a few years ago to go on an educational visit to South Africa, where we toured in Durban lots of former white, black, Asian and coloured schools. And the discrepancies between the two types of schools, or the different types of schools, was huge. So from a white school looking something like you'd expect at Eton, with tablecloths on the table and vases with flowers in the children's canteen, to a former black school which had no windows, no electricity, no running water, very few resources, 90 children to a class. So that is the inequality that the system of apartheid entrenched into South African society. And even though apartheid has ended, what we have to acknowledge is, even though that's only 20, 30 years ago that that's ended, there was massive inequalities at the time that it was, you know, that Mandela became president, etc. That hasn't rebalanced the economy. It hasn't allowed all of those children who received a poor education in poor facilities to be able to catch up. And so some of those things are still embedded. We had the Windrush scandal a few years ago in this country. We had people being invited over here from the Commonwealth, which is, for want of a better word, clearly not shared. So we had people coming from the Commonwealth coming to help rebuild the country. And then you had Enoch Powell saying, whoa, hold on a minute, it's going a bit too far here. This is going to affect our culture and our identity. And so then we went on to the Race Relations Act. And when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, the Race Relations Amendment Act. What staggered me was a couple of years ago when we had the Brexit campaign, the poster that you see on the screen. If you possibly won't be able to see it unless you zoom in, but that poster is very similar to a poster that was around at the time of Enoch Powell, which was called The Rivers, when he gave the Rivers of Blood speech. And if you zoom into that poster, which is talking about the fear of immigration and the breaking point that Britain was reaching, what you don't see, unless you zoom in, is that it's not just a sea of people, it's a sea of people with brown faces. And really what the Brexit campaign, or some aspects of it, certainly that poster, was getting at was, we want to keep Britain white. And I know that's not everybody's reason for voting for Brexit, but certainly that poster speaks 1,000 words about our attitude to racism. So the reason I'm sharing this slide here is to just highlight how racism has prevailed. We thought we had moved on with the Race Relations Act and after Stephen Lawrence, and then here we have the Brexit campaign, and it's taken us back about 30 years or so to the same type of thinking that we had when people were being overtly racist. And that showed me that you don't have to have much of a pressure in society, or you don't really have to come to, you know, we've had economic difficulties over the past few decades. You don't have to scratch far under the surface of the fabric of our communities and societies for racism to rear its ugly head again. And that's exactly what happened when we had the Brexit campaign. So we need to try and understand the motivation. Why is it that we keep coming back to this point? So Nicola, if you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So why has there been so much lack of motivation to address racism or colorism, particularly oppression of Black people in society? We need to think about that in terms of resources and what's happening at the moment. So if you look at the first map of Africa, it's showing you all the different countries in Europe that colonized different parts of Africa in the initial scramble for Africa that took place during, you know, and around the time of the slave trade, etc. Then you've got another map, which is a more contemporary map. And what that's showing you today is where all the natural resources are in Africa and what kind of resources Africa has. So this, for me, raises questions about why is there so much potentially disunity in African politics? You know, we've had for different periods in the past where people have tried to promote Pan-Africanism and Africa uniting as a political force to try and help their own people and to progress economically and develop on a similar level that you'd have across America or across Europe. But there's not been a vested interest in that happening, because if that happened, then we wouldn't have countries that are more advanced for economic benefit plundering the natural resources, which is what's actually happening at the moment. So this economic boom or technological advancement that we have, a lot of that is based on or dependent on exploiting the natural resources in many parts of Africa. And so I would argue, and this is my personal argument, and you might not agree with it, that that is an undercurrent and an incentive for why there is, certainly in terms of Africa and trying to advance things on the continent of Africa, why that's not in other economies' best interest, because there's too much at stake, and money tends to be the thing that speaks. So that's just my view. If we were in face to face and we had a bit more time, I would use this opportunity for you to maybe discuss that and explore it, maybe give some feedback on what you actually think about it, and just thinking about, you know, the sort of power and control around those natural resources in African countries, and how that makes people of African descent feel. If you are of African origin and you're in different parts of the world, living in other economies, how psychologically does that impact on you to know what has happened and what is happening in the place that you have come from? And you know, that's something that we would want to explore and discuss. So Nicola, if you want to move on the slide, please. So finally, I would talk about my personal experiences of racism. If you were delivering this conversation piece within your organisation, and if we had more time, I would ask you to discuss and share some of your personal experiences of racism. So I think in the breakout group earlier, I had Abby sharing an issue that someone had one of her colleagues had in her workplace, just simply trying to get a lanyard to go to work and being met with obstacles and microaggressions. And I'm sure there are lots of people in this session today who would be able to share their views and experiences, and just to make sure everybody's absolutely certain that racism is very much alive and kicking in this country, even within social work, where we are supposed to be committed to anti-oppressive practice. So my experience is just a sort of quick run through. As I said, I grew up in Liverpool, and I regularly was harassed by this little boy who was overtly racist, would shout the N-word, would generally punch me in the stomach on my way to school or whenever he saw me, and wind me. And one of the days he asked me to, he came over and asked if I'd seen some children, and as I turned round to point and show him where I'd seen them, he threw a handful of builder's grit in my eyes. And that stayed with me throughout my life. You know, it was many years ago now, but I remember that event and just trusting someone and feeling, oh, he's actually being nice today. And then actually it was just his way of being, you know, getting me to sort of open up so that he could be really mean. I talked about the fact that where I lived in the house, not on the end, the next one, but that house on the end is where people used to live, and they would put National Front stickers on our front door next door. And then when I became a teacher, which was my job before I became a social worker, I was a vegan before it became trendy, and used to shop at Holland and Barrett. And when I first became a teacher, I remember being followed around the shop by the staff in a shop in Birmingham. And she asked me to show her what was up my sleeve, and I was absolutely mortified. I hadn't stolen anything. I wouldn't dream of stealing anything. But I think what that made me think at the time was, does she think I shouldn't be in a shop like this? It's a bit more sort of a selective shop at that time. It was more expensive than maybe some other shops, and that for me also stayed with me. And then I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go to an international college, and we're having a reunion next weekend, and we've been having online pre-reunion chats and stuff with the students. And one of the students, who very wealthy, very educated, white, from Western Europe, was talking about how she brought her children to London to see where she lived as a student when she was at uni, and her children were saying, oh, you must have been really poor. But this is when she's doing a tour of somewhere like Chelsea in London, which we know is really affluent and, you know, very sort of selective and elite. And her response was to say, oh, I'll have to take them to Africa to show them what poverty is. And the reason I shared that, this is a picture of I think a favela in Brazil or South America, next to some opulent luxury in Brazil, literally side by side. The reason I shared that is because no amount of education or wealth or experience, this is somebody who's been to an international school, lived alongside people from different diverse backgrounds, but still has demonstrated as an adult a level of ignorance that can be quite damaging. So I think it's really important that we recognise that there's a need to have these conversations and to be able to challenge some of the things that we face and we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So if you just move on, Nicola, please. Sorry, I feel like I'm racing through all of this. So these are the sorts of things that I would want you to think about and have a discussion about as part of the conversation piece. As a social worker, how comfortable are you in challenging racism? Do we need safe spaces for dialogue, and should we wait for someone affected to complain? Often, you know, people will say, oh, we don't have racism here, it's fine here, because no one said anything. But should they have to say something, or should you go and ask if they are okay? Have they had an issue? Has anyone made a comment about it? I think that's important. And when we delivered this and tested this conversation piece out with some of our colleagues, they would say we're quite happy having those conversations at home with our family and friends, but they felt they would be less comfortable challenging a manager or a team member about racism if they saw it. And I think we need to try and facilitate those conversations. And if you are a manager or in a position of authority listening to this presentation, I would say you maybe need to take the initiative in opening up the floor to have those kinds of conversations. The second point is, how can we challenge some of the embedded thinking and the power imbalance within the structures that we have? I've talked about colonisation and economic incentives for racism. If we look at, so imagine you do like a domestic abuse wheel of power and control, but you map it against racism. There's all sorts of examples of things that have happened to Black people to do with economic abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse. If you look at racism through that lens, then you really start to get a good understanding, a broad understanding of the impact it's had. And only by doing that can we come up with workable solutions that are likely to have an impact or to change what goes on. The next one is about a bit of reflexivity. So how do your own perspectives and emotions about race impact on your interactions with Black people? What are the challenges with being honest and open about our prejudices, beliefs and ideologies? We might be scared or nervous about having the conversation, but I would rather you have it and maybe you say something that's a bit complicated or uncomfortable than not have the conversation. And the best way to do that maybe is just to open your conversation by saying, look, I might get some of the language wrong here, or I might say something that not everyone agrees with, but something is bothering me. There's something I'm not comfortable with, and I'd like to raise this issue. We don't have to claim to have all of the answers. We don't have to claim to be an expert. You don't need to be Black or from a minority ethnic group to start a conversation about racism. We can all take responsibility for that, and don't leave it to the person who's experiencing it to be the one who raises it as an issue. And then when we're working with our families and children, how can we make sure we consider their highest context? Are we aware of where they're coming from in terms of their race and ethnicity and their experiences of racism and oppression? And yeah, how do we tackle that in some of the work that we're doing as social workers? So if we had a bit more time, I would want to give you time to go into breakout rooms and discuss some of these questions. But what I would hope is you will take the conversation pieces and go and have these conversations and talk about these questions in your organisation with your team members or other colleagues, to try and stimulate and raise awareness of some of these things. And where I've talked about my personal experiences, you would be able to talk about your personal experiences. So following that, I would say, I would hope that you would take some kind of action pledge away from this. I think Nicola's going to talk about that maybe at the end of the day. But I would consider, you know, how do we tackle some of the difficult conversations that we need to have as social work professionals? We do it every day. We're constantly going into people's houses and raising questions and having to help people to realise things that might be uncomfortable. So I think we're already skilled up in that respect, and it's about how we now apply that to tackle an anti-racism within our organisations internally, but also in our outward facing work as we work with our service users, children and families. And I'll stop there. I think we've got like maybe a minute or so, I don't know, for questions. I'll hand back over to you, Nicola. Thank you.